Hey everybody, this is chapter 5 of Hillel Ticktin's book, Origins of the Crisis in the USSR, Essays on the Political Economy of a Disintegrating System. This chapter is titled The Intelligentsia. Let's see. Hell yeah, I guessed the page number on the PDF and I got it. Who's the boss? I'm the boss. Okay. Let's boogie. The Intelligentsia. Since it is part of the overall argument of this book that the Intelligentsia are the group that has benefited most from the Gorbachev regime, it will be instructive to observe how the position of the Intelligentsia has changed. There are more members of the Intelligentsia employed in 1987 than in 1941. 15,530,000 as opposed to 1 million. In addition, there is an intermediate layer of specialist technicians of all kinds, numbering some 20 million. As a result, they are a more powerful social group, particularly the writers, propagandists, and those closer and more important to the elite. But over time, there has been a steady decline in the position of all sections of the Intelligentsia against those holding manual jobs. Whereas skilled workers in ferrous metallurgy might be earning around 400 rubles per month, an engineer or research worker could be earning as little as 150 to 200 rubles. Indeed, semi-skilled workers can earn more than those with university education. Below the level of the elite are the specialists, some 23,347,000 in 1985, of whom 9,622,000 had higher education and 10,776,000 had technical education. Footnote. Never mind, no footnote. Just a citation. The difference in figures for the Intelligentsia and specialists gives the numbers of the Intelligentsia in the elite and in the manual workforce. There were some 4.1 million in the elite in 1985 and approximately 500,000 who have become skilled workers. Footnote. In 1987, some 578,800 persons with higher education were working as manual workers. Note that in spite of glasnost, or perhaps because of it, and the attacks on privilege, the USSR has not published the statistics for the elite beyond 1985. End footnote. We have already mentioned the relatively rapid rise in numbers in the Intelligentsia relative to the numbers in the elite. In historical terms, the picture is as follows. The crucial figure is that in 1941 there were only 909,000 persons with higher education in the economy, as opposed to 15 million in 1986. In parallel, the number of technical specialists rose from 1,492,000 to 19,600,000. With the workforce today totaling some 130 million, the two groups combined constitute some 26.4% of the employed, compared to 3.9% in 1940. For those with higher education, the increase has been from 1.5% to 11.5% of the employed. As discussed in the previous chapter, only 27.8% of those with higher education could enter the elite in 1985. New section. The political economy of the Intelligentsia. In the USSR, the term, quote, Intelligentsia is employed as a category to describe all those with higher education, whether they possess a diploma or not. if there includes academicians as well as ordinary engineers working in plants who receive a salary considerably below the average wage of around 200 rubles. Doctors and teachers, who also receive very low wages, are also part of the intelligentsia. Clearly, a better definition is required. Footnote: it is important to make a distinction between an intellectual and a member of the intelligentsia. These are quite different terms. The intellectual is involved with the world of ideas, usually with a critical assessment of the society of which he is a part, whereas the members of the Soviet intelligentsia are those who alienate their labor power in order to engage in non-manual work. The anti-Semites and Russian chauvinists of Pomiat and other organizations, including the Union of Russian Writers, are usually members of the Soviet intelligentsia. Whether people holding these views could be termed intellectuals is dubious. The term, quote, intelligentsia, end quote, therefore refers to a particular social group in the society. The reason for the confusion between the two groups is that the Russian noun intelligent was used to apply to genuine thinking and critical intellectuals of Tsarist times. End footnote. The intelligentsia in the USSR is a social group that stands between workers and the elite. The intelligentsia's topmost layer is the elite itself, and indeed has played an increasing role within the elite. Then there are the 1.5 million research workers in the USSR, whose salaries were quickly raised by Gorbachev in May 1985. They work in institutes closely connected to some aspect of the economy and society. The functionalist role of the, quote, scientific workers, end quote, in the USSR is part of the system. Even sociologists perform the immediately useful function of ameliorating the lot of the worker in order that he may perform better. The output of the higher educational institutions could not be absorbed by the enterprises or ministries, and hence graduate employment has been provided by a huge system of bureaucratic relief. The layer of the intelligentsia that is just below the elite, the middle-level executives of the enterprises and institutes, is male and upwardly mobile. By contrast, doctors and teachers, who are at the bottom of the intelligentsia in pay and prestige, are very largely female. They approximate much more closely to workers, alienating their labor for defined periods of time and without any control over others. This inferior position of women in the intelligentsia parallels their position in the elite and in the workforce. While men are more directly involved in production or forms of control over others, women perform the function of dealing with the social services of the society. As social services have been neglected, women have had to accept poor remuneration, poor conditions of work, and poor job prospects. The intelligentsia, then, cannot be regarded as a cohesive group, yet the intelligentsia have tended to behave in a cohesive manner. Although the intelligentsia's viewpoints may be radically different, some want an authoritarian Russian nationalist regime, while others want a liberal social democratic regime. Their attitudes, however, have been consistently elitist, regarding workers as, quote, cattle, to use a favorite Soviet epithet. They perceive themselves as the foundation of the society and natural leaders, who were oppressed by Stalin and the regime itself. Quote, Stalin had always been hostile to and suspicious of the intelligentsia, end quote. V.N. Dashichev. From one angle, this is understandable since their position is that of a layer between workers and elite. They aspire to enter the elite, but the workers have overtaken many of them in remuneration. In this, they approximate the classic position of the petite bourgeoisie, who are ground between the two great classes of capitalism, the workers and the bourgeoisie. It is not surprising, therefore, that many of them have turned to anti-Semitism and nationalism. From the viewpoint of political economy, the intelligentsia may be defined as all those who both alienate their labor power and assist in the process of extraction of the surplus product, usually by being in charge of others. The great bulk of the intelligentsia work in enterprises, in one way or another in charge of workers. Even the so-called scientific workers are often involved in trying to find a way to raise the surplus product squeezed out of the direct producer. While they are not directly in charge of anyone, they are assisting the process of extracting the surplus product. Doctors and teachers, overwhelmingly female, do not entirely fit into this definition. Of course, they assist the process of extraction of the surplus product, by ensuring that the workers are able to function as workers. But in fact, it is not their occupational prestige, which is low, but their position within the family, as wives of engineers, academicians, and so forth, that determines their social position. It is difficult to imagine men who were so poorly compensated and so tightly controlled who could not have joined allegiance with ordinary workers. Who would not have joined allegiance with ordinary workers, but then men in such occupations would almost certainly not be treated so shoddily. The special position of women is very important in understanding the political economy of the USSR. We return to this question later, when discussing the nature of the divisions in the workforce and so the forms of control over the workers. The concept of dependence was discussed in Chapter 3. The total dependence of members of the intelligentsia on their colleagues at work for their everyday needs has made for a compliant body of individuals who at the same time are very discontented. For them it is this bureaucratic apparatus in which they find themselves enmeshed that has to be smashed. Paradoxically, they have long demanded freedom of speech, imagining that it would solve their problems. To a large degree they have been granted their wish today, under Gorbachev, with the virtual abolition of the censor. They have found that it is not enough. Like everyone else, they want a higher standard of living, in addition to the kind of freedom possessed by their counterparts in the West. They want the indirect dependence provided by the use of money. That doctors and engineers are far better off in the West is quite clear. Teachers and academics would similarly be better off in a market. Discussions of the role of the intelligentsia arouse extraordinary passions. On the one hand, there are those who seek to support the Soviet intelligentsia and so ignore their particular social position in Soviet society. On the other hand, the long anarchist tradition, which incorporates the work of Makhaiski, which is spelled weird, I think it's Makhaiski is how you actually say it, is only too ready to denounce the Soviet intelligentsia as a living proof that the Bolshevik Revolution led to the takeover of the intellectuals, who then dispossessed the workers. The work of Ivan Zeleny has also given the intelligentsia a particular political role in society. Footnote. George Conrad and Ivan Zeleny, Intellectuals on the Road to Class Power, a sociological study of the role of the intelligentsia in socialism. No member of published in 1979. No member of the intelligentsia has developed to the point of critically assessing the nature of the Soviet Union as well as capitalism. I think Ivan Zeleny, like if you watch like the Yale, any of like the Yale courses, I think he teaches like the introduction to sociology Yale course. Anyway, end footnote, back to the text. Zeleny has argued that the intelligentsia possess the monopoly of knowledge and so have established themselves in power. The argument of the present book is that only a section of the intelligentsia is actually in power while the rest are divided, although eager to take power. The intelligentsia, then, is to be seen as a social group standing between the elite and the workers that has historically been used by the elite to maintain its rule. This has been accomplished by dividing them from the workers and using sections of the intelligentsia as a lightning rod for discontent. Anti-Semitism has played the traditional scapegoat role under Stalin and Stalin's successors. Nationalism has had the functionalist role of separating the workers of different parts of the USSR, and is the intelligentsia that has developed the role of nationalism and separatism. One condition for change, then, has to be the disintegration of the intelligentsia itself, with sections seeking their salvation in the historic role of the universal class, the working class. That is precisely what Stalinism has hitherto prevented and Gorbachev is continuing to prevent. Indeed, the turn to parliamentarism can also be seen in this perspective. Threatened by the possibility of working-class action, the elite has moved to incorporate the intelligentsia in a multifaceted parliamentary mold. Anyone who asks for more can be branded with the standard work of modern Soviet abuse: extremist. New section: the debate on history and rehabilitations. The effort to attach the intelligentsia to the elite has involved a three-pronged policy. First, their salaries have been raised. Second, censorship has been curtailed. Third is the process of rehabilitation and introduction of the rule of law, intended to reassure the intelligentsia that they will never again be vulnerable. The move to the market is also in their interest, as argued above, but that is a long-term policy. Concessions to the intelligentsia reached the Khrushchev-era level by the end of 1985. The release of Sakharov, and political prisoners was a further gesture, although Marchenko died in a prison camp, and the KGB continued to victimize dissidents. The hell's going on here? Sorry, I'm trying to look up Sakharov. Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov lived between 1921 and 1989 and was a Soviet physicist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, which Sakharov was awarded in 1975 for emphasizing human rights around the world. Although Sakharov spent his career in physics in the Soviet program of nuclear weapons, overseeing the development of thermonuclear weapons, Andrei Sakharov also did fundamental work in understanding particle physics, magnetism, and physical cosmology. Sakharov is mostly known for his political activism for individual freedom, human rights, civil liberties, and reforms in the Soviet Union, for which Andrei Sakharov was deemed a dissident and faced persecution from the Soviet establishment. In Sakharov's memory, the Sakharov Prize was established and is awarded annually by the European Parliament for people and organizations dedicated to human rights and freedoms. Marchenko Anatoly Marchenko lived from 1938 to 1986, was a Soviet dissident author and human rights campaigner who became one of the first two recipients, along with Nelson Mandela, of the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought of the European Parliament when it was awarded to him posthumously in 1988. Marchenko, originally an apolitical oil driller from a poor background, turned to writing and politics as a result of several episodes of incarceration starting in 1958, during which he began to associate with other dissidents. Marchenko gained international fame in 1969 through Anatoly Marchenko's book, My Testimony, an autobiographical account written after Anatoly Marchenko's arrival in Moscow in 1966 about his then recent sentences in Soviet labor camps and prisons. After limited circulation inside the Soviet Union as samizdat, the book caused a sensation in the West after My Testimony by Anatoly Marchenko revealed that the Soviet Gulag system had continued after the death of Joseph Stalin. In 1968, in the run-up to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, Anatoly Marchenko wrote an open letter predicting the invasion. Arrested again, Anatoly Marchenko was released in the early 1970s, but in 1974, Anatoly Marchenko was interrogated and internally exiled to Irkutsk Oblast. In 1976, Marchenko became one of the founding members of the Moscow-Helsinki Group before again being arrested and imprisoned in 1981, where Anatoly Marchenko kept writing throughout Anatoly Marchenko's prison time, publicizing the fate of Soviet political prisoners. Having spent about 20 years in all in prison and internal exile, Nathan Sharansky said of him, quote, after the release of Yuri Fyodorovich Orlov, he was definitely the number one Soviet prisoner of conscience, end quote, becoming one of the Soviet Union's, quote, perpetual prisoners, end quote. Anatoly Marchenko died at 48 in Chistopol Prison Hospital as a result of a 3-month-long hunger strike, the goal of which was the release of all Soviet prisoners of conscience. The widespread international outcry over Anatoly Marchenko's death was a major factor in finally pushing then-Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev to authorize the large-scale amnesty of political prisoners in 1987. Back to the text. It said he died in a prison camp, but it says he died in a prison hospital, which might be part of a prison camp. I don't know. The next step towards incorporating in the Intelligentsia required that past repressions be condemned. This began with the rehabilitation of Bukharin and discussion of the unpersonage of Trotsky, the role of Stalin, and more recently that of Lenin. It appears that the struggle around these issues reflects the operation of different factions. Gorbachev's November 1987 attack on Stalin as personally guilty of crimes was an attack on a wing of the elite. By identifying Stalin with terror, Gorbachev threatened the control bureaucracy. Gorbachev then threatened to speak of Stalin positively. Gorbachev then retreated to speak of Stalin positively in connection with the war, presumably to mollify elements of the elite who either continue from the war period or invoke the war period to justify the system. The mistake made by those on the left is that they identified these discussions with a real possibility of return to the politics of Bukharin, or at least anti-Stalinism. In fact, Gorbachev is merely acting to destroy the opposition. By exposing the terror of the 1930s and the reality of an alternative, Gorbachev weakens both ideologically and personally the position of those who stand only for control. It may be true that Stalin, Beria, Molotov, Voroshilov, Malenkov, and the rest are dead, but those who rose to power under them are not. It is noteworthy, therefore, that Gorbachev was forced to defend the war generation, because the war generation are precisely the group identified with Brezhnev and other so-called conservatives. Footnote: the newspapers had already printed attacks on Stalin, Voroshilov, and others for their conduct of military preparations for the war, accusing Stalin, and Voroshilov, and others not only of purges of Tukhachevsky and the rest of the officer corps, but of sheer stupidity in that they opposed the latter's demands for tanks and planes. See Viktor Anfilov, Ot Ostuplenia K. Pobeda, Literaturniana Gazeta, 17th of May, 1987. The article is in honor of Zhukov, but in fact uses Zhukov as an excuse to attack Stalin and Stalin's supporters for incompetence of an extreme kind, liquidation of the specialized units, and refusal to produce and use tanks and airplanes, presumably to preserve the cavalry and thus Budeni. The message is not unclear. The modern supporters of the old school are antiquated and tarred with the brush of mass liquidation of great revolutionaries. End footnote. The rehabilitation of Bukharin threw into question the whole policy of the 1930s. Indeed, what could be more advantageous than the rehabilitation of Bukharin, the inventor of Stalinist ideology, the man who put forward the concepts of socialism in one country and socialist realism, produced a scholastic Marxism, and above all appears as a humanist and a supporter of peasants and the market. Bukharin is indeed the ideal icon for the modernized Stalinist regime. Of course, the real Bukharin was much more contradictory. Bukharin opposed the existence of the market under socialism, arguing only for the market's temporary necessity in the conditions of the USSR. Bukharin was also on the left of the regime from 1917 to 1921, so much opposing, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, that in 1917 he wanted to continue the war against Germany. Footnote: the publication and production of Mikhail Shatrov's play Onward, 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 precisely on the theme of the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, makes quite clear where Bukharin stood in this period. See Michael Glennie, Glasnost Brings Trotsky Back to Life, in the Sunday Times, London, 29th of November 1987, quote, Bukharin in particular is given the full rehabilitation treatment, end quote. Michael Glenny correctly points to the political utility of the play in that Onward, Onward, Onward appeared to give Lenin's backing for the signing of a disadvantageous treaty, just as Gorbachev was doing the same with Russia. End footnote. Trotsky had to be cleansed of the absurdities flung against Trotsky and made to appear, as they now say, as a courageous Civil War leader, but indecisive, vain, and ambitious, a man sometimes correct on some questions, but wrong on all important issues. Footnote. This is how Trotsky is depicted in Shatrov's play. See also Egor Yakovlev, Pervo Pravitelstvo, Izvestia, 12th of July, 1987, page 3. In Shatrov's reference to Trotsky, in his reference to Trotsky, Yakovlev, the editor of Moscow News, describes him as someone in the workers' movement for 17 years, exiled to Siberia, who was appointed commissar for foreign affairs in the first Soviet government. Then, he quotes Lenin saying that Trotsky holds no views on the important questions and hence cannot be argued with. This is ambiguous in that it brings out the point that Lenin and Trotsky had in fact had few important differences at the time of the revolution, while on the other hand implying that Trotsky stood on the fence. Any intelligent reader will get the point that Trotsky was no agent of the bourgeoisie, but an important leader. His views have to be considered, even though evidently wrong. The main debate around Trotsky at this stage is summarized in The Guardian on the 28th of September, 1987. End footnote. Following the February 1988 plenum of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Pravda, on the 26th of February 1988, opened a discussion of the 1920s, beginning with Lenin's last days and Lenin's testament. Stalin is shown as a competent organizer, but crude and capable of abusing power. Trotsky is described as having had considerable support among the workers, and especially the youth. Trotsky was a good orator and by implication a demagogue. Mention is made of Trotsky's anti-Bolshevism as a warning that no one should take up his cause. Bukharin, by contrast, is described as having made mistakes when Bukharin was on the left until 1921. Thereafter, Bukharin was approved by Lenin. Other voices have argued that Stalin was, for all practical purposes, a pupil of Trotsky in his industrialization policy. In other words, Stalin and Trotsky alike were wrong and dangerous. Footnote. Afanasyev declared that the rehabilitation of Trotsky by some Stalinists had been handled in such a way as to perpetuate Stalinism. Afanasyev considers Trotsky a genuine Civil War leader, but otherwise a demon. In an interview in EKO, IUS Borisov, a department head in the Academy of Science Institute of History, effectively argues that Trotsky is ultimately responsible for the economic system in the USSR. End footnote. The real danger of discussing Trotsky's views is rooted in the fact that even now, Trotsky's views are subversive of the regime in their attack on privilege and bureaucratic control, whereas the regime had no fear of politically rehabilitating Bukharin. Footnote. The rehabilitations have involved such figures as Chayanov and Andratev, well known for their pro-peasant views. To emphasize the importance of these thinkers, Professor Theodore Shannon of Manchester University was invited to the USSR to speak on Chayanov. In this way, the regime is ensuring that a right alternative holds the stage. Indeed, as the discussants at a Literaturnaya Gazeta forum emphasized, a new orthodoxy is being established, is a right-wing orthodoxy. End footnote. The history of the USSR is one of left opposition. Hence, it is not impossible that a section of the elite are actually pushing for the rehabilitation of an emasculated but critical Trotsky. Footnote: by the end of 1989, at least 9 pieces called from the work of Trotsky had been printed, usually with commentaries. The attacks on Trotsky continued, but Trotsky was also described as a courageous man who was correct on various issues, including his attack on Stalin and the bureaucracy. Even permanent revolution was discussed, although in a patronizing and rueful tone. Vопроsi Ekonomiki, the economic journal of the Academy of Sciences Institute of Economics, published an extract from The Revolution Portrayed with a commentary by academician Emelianov, and approves of Trotsky's attack on bureaucracy and sees him as a forerunner of perestroika. As Vопроsi Ekonomiki, 1989, number 12, the issue includes an article by V. Ivanovsky on bureaucracy as a class, written in 1903. The inclusion of the latter article from the Tsarist period is parallel with Trotsky, clearly indicates the view of bureaucracy preferred by the editors of the journal. Fragments from Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, with an introduction and commentary by N.A. Vazetsky, were published in Historia SSSR in 1990, number 2. End footnote. The publicity about Trotsky is not explicable simply in terms of cleansing history. It is more likely that a group within the elite can see the advantage of accepting his critique of privilege, his paean of praise for planning and industrialization, and his denunciation of Stalinism. Accepting Trotsky's characterization of the USSR as a degenerated worker state, they could argue that the task is to regenerate it. They could then abolish official privilege and replace official privilege with differential salaries based on the market. This would amount to a kind of social democratic reform of the regime, and indeed is the only hope that the regime might have for success, slim as it might be, for it could involve just enough bamboozlement and enough concessions to enthuse potentially left sections of the intelligentsia and the working class. Footnote: academician Emelianov's critique of bureaucracy and approval of Trotsky has to be seen in this light. N.A. Vazetsky observed in 1990 that all the old Bolsheviks whose work had been reprinted, it was Trotsky was attracting growing interest. In 1986, Vazetsky had published Aut, quote, Revolutionizionoi, end quote, Fazi ke bez rasudnomi aventourismum, devoted to exposing various, quote, reactionary Trotskyist theories, end quote. Vazetsky works in the Ideological Commission of the Communist Party. At the Trotsky conference held in Wuppertal, West Germany at the end of March 1990, Vazetsky made it clear that he had published what he had to produce. Incidentally, this conference, in which upward of 20 Soviet historians and other social scientists participated, along with well-known Western specialists on Trotsky and equally well-known Trotskyist intellectuals, marked a watershed. End footnote. Hence, the regime could well open the door wide and find out too late that it had made a mistake. Although the left opposition is history, a working class critique is not. Although the left opposition is history, a working class critique is not. And the left opposition produced the first such critique. The old Bolsheviks were killed precisely because of their old Bolsheviks. The old Bolsheviks were killed precisely because they were old Bolsheviks. Contrary to the protestations of some, it is perfectly possible that those on trial wished to remove Stalin from power and were plotting to that effect. Indeed, there is such evidence for at least some of them. They would have had to be utterly useless had they been at least attempting preliminary discussions to that eventuality. Stalin was thus correct in his accusation. Any authority takes extreme measures when threatened. In disposing of the issue of the show trials, the regime thus achieves three goals. It undermines its internal opposition in the elite, who were historically associated with such crimes. It removes the attraction of illegality around the old Bolsheviks, and it permits the introduction of a new pragmatic language within the elite. Footnote: the legal rehabilitation of Bukharin, which took place on the 4th of February 1988, was accompanied by the rehabilitation of others of less importance, but also by the rehabilitation of Christian Rakovsky. Rakovsky was in fact the second in command to Trotsky in the left opposition in theoretical and status terms. Once the so-called, quote, right Trotskyist bloc, end quote, was declared blameless of crime, the way was open to the left opposition. Within months, all victims of the show trials were rehabilitated, and then practically everyone else incarcerated or murdered by Stalin. On the 21st of June 1988, the Soviet authorities took a further step when they restored Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky, the right opposition, to membership in the party. They added a number of others, most particularly Rakovsky and Krestinsky, both of whom had been members of the left opposition. End footnote. New section: legality and the rule of law. The issue of rehabilitations has been framed as one of legality. The need for the rule of law appears to be crucial for the reformers. Izvestia, on the 10th of April 1988, carried an article on the show trials, in which Izvestia stressed the terror used by Vyshinsky against the accused, particularly Krestinsky. The article subtly attacks the sections of the police and army apparatus who would prefer to use force, and directly mentions the reintroduction of secret trials under Brezhnev. Andrei Vyshinsky lived from 1883 to 1954 and was a Soviet politician, jurist, and diplomat. Vyshinsky is best known as a state prosecutor of Joseph Stalin's Moscow trials and in the Nuremberg trials. Vyshinsky was the Soviet foreign minister from 1949 to 1953, after having served as the deputy foreign minister under Vyacheslav Molotov since 1940. He headed the Institute of State and Law in the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union. Nikolai Krestinsky lived from 1883 to 1938 and was a Soviet Bolshevik revolutionary and politician who served as the responsible secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Born in Mogilev to a Ukrainian family, Krestinsky studied law at St. Petersburg Imperial University, where Nikolai Krestinsky embraced revolutionary politics. Nikolai Krestinsky became a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, in 1903, and 2 years later, Nikolai Krestinsky supported Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction following the RSDLP split. Repeatedly arrested, Nikolai Krestinsky was exiled to the Urals in 1914 before the outbreak of the First World War. After the 1917 February Revolution brought an end to the monarchy, Nikolai Krestinsky led the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg before returning to Petrograd. Nikolai Krestinsky was named People's Commissar for Finance and elected to the first Politburo. After the death of Yakov Sverdlov, Nikolai Krestinsky also served as responsible secretary of the Russian Communist Party. Nikolai Krestinsky was an ally of Leon Trotsky and supported the left opposition. With the rise of Joseph Stalin, Nikolai Krestinsky gradually fell from power and lost his positions in the government, save for his post as Soviet ambassador to Germany. Nikolai Krastinsky eventually repudiated his opposition and capitulated to Stalin. Krastinsky was arrested in 1937 in the Great Purge and charged with treason. He was found guilty in the 1938 trial of the 21 and executed. End footnote. Or not end footnote, back to the text. I'm not sure if this is who the Vaxburg being referred to is, but I'm guessing it is. Arkady Vaxburg lived from 1927 to 2011. Arkady Vaxburg was a Soviet and Russian lawyer, investigative journalist, writer on historical subjects, filmmaker, and playwright. Back to the text. Vaxburg's attack on Wyszynski at first sight appears to be a move to the left in that it completely rehabilitates all the old Bolsheviks put on trial or imprisoned under the chief prosecutor of the late 1930s. I was right about who it was, Arkady Vaxburg. On the other hand, a closer reading shows that the form and detail are of a legalistic and orthodox Western approach. Implicit is a philosophy of the need for a division of powers, independence of the judiciary, and proper rights for defendants, all of which is laudable and would greatly improve matters if introduced. The contradiction is that a separation of powers in the form required is impossible, where a judge is dependent for his housing and privileges on the local Soviet and the party. In any case, the USSR exists on the edge of a precipice. The elite, correctly, perceives themselves as under threat from below. Under these circumstances, it is very difficult for legal reform to have much effect, since the elite are not likely to provide the instruments for their own overthrow. Accordingly, the right of the KGB to deal with internal subversion as the KGB sees fit has been reinforced. Furthermore, as long as the real dependence of the individual on the structure, and hence directly on other individuals, is maintained, no legal framework will defend the individual against the state or the elite. Where there is no money, as in the USSR, resources for the administration of justice always have to be provided by the state. This always entails personal decisions in relation to both the prosecution and defense. Vaxburg has pointed out that there are some 1 million rubles in the USSR that are not laws. Jesus Christ. Vaxburg has pointed out that there are some 1 million rules in the USSR that are not laws but have the force of law. Such rules exist wherever there is a bureaucratic form. Obviously, a prolixity of rules is counterproductive in that judges cannot know the rules or how to apply the rules. On the other hand, rules arise out of everyday need for them. Rules can only be abolished when sufficient trust exists between different parts of the system. Where, however, there is a necessary contradiction within the elite itself, rules are of the essence of the system, and any codification will be quickly overtaken by an avalanche of modifications. Another function is also facilitated. Vaxburg and the State Commission working on codification are really concerned with the introduction of procedures that approximate to a rule of law. An oligarchy that appears to function impartially is much more secure than one that is inefficient and vindictive. Hence, arbitrariness has to be eliminated. Strict procedures are to be followed. Corruption will thereby be rooted out. Yet, there are fundamental reasons for believing that neither arbitrariness nor corruption can be removed from the system, whatever the good intentions of the liberals in the Soviet regime. Gorbachev has explicitly linked the economic reforms with democracy. Hence, the debate around the figure of Bukharin was an ideal way to link the two aspects of the reform program. Bukharin's rehabilitation is a gesture to truth and more open discussion, but also a means to acceptance of the market itself. The real questions of the introduction of the market or how to introduce the market without antagonizing the majority of the population, and whether the repression necessary for the market's introduction can be combined with the kind of democratic reforms needed to appease the intelligentsia and sections of the working class. The market has coexisted with mass repression for most of its existence, so that the rather simplistic, if not pathetic, argument that it must necessarily lead to or require democracy cannot be entertained. What is true is that democracy is essential for the elite and probably also for a considerable portion of the intelligentsia. But there is every reason why workers have to be kept outside such a democracy if they are not to control the product themselves, as they cannot if there is to be a market. On the other hand, there are aspects of the society that have to be changed for any level of efficiency to exist. For one thing, deception and avoidance of the truth are not conducive to consistent or realistic planning, while the absence of a genuine discourse, as opposed to a counter-conceptual one, such as Stalinism, requires the use of more empirically based language, rather than, quote, Marxism-Leninism, end quote. Indeed, whatever the reforms may be, there can be no hope whatsoever of their success if there cannot be a critical discussion of their progress. This problem, however, is insuperable because any real discussion must come up against the nature of socialism itself. With the majority controlling, work become humanity's prime want, interchangeability of occupations within the division of labor, and hence the abolition of the elite itself. Western economists may accept the eternal nature of exploitation, but workers will not. A new justification has thus to be provided, a task that will not be easy. The end. Thank you for listening.